Chapter 1. In my previous life, after the college entrance exams, I had the best grades in the family, making me the only one with a real chance of going to university. Following discussions with Andrew, my mother announced, in front of everyone, who would inherit the family property. Though the house was less than 60 square meters, she spoke of it as if it were a priceless treasure. Surprisingly, my brother, who had always treated me like an enemy, didn't fight me for it. He kept his head lowered, saying nothing, though the faint smirk on his lips was anything but innocent. My stepsister Mia, however, couldn't contain her frustration and angrily confronted her father. "Why does she get everything?" she demanded. Her father cast her a cold glance and let out a dismissive sneer. Mia, who never dared to act out in front of her father, reluctantly swallowed her grievances. And just like that, I was declared the rightful heir to the house. For the first time in years, my mother dropped her icy demeanor. She warmly hugged me, her tone unusually affectionate. "Wendy, from now on, our family's future depends on you." I thought, perhaps, that this was her long-dormant maternal love finally resurfacing. I didn't care about the house. I just wanted to savor this rare moment of warmth from her. But Mia glared at me with undisguised envy, as if she wished she could snatch this unexpected wealth for herself. Yet, less than a month later, I died in a car accident. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back in time, 2 years before the college entrance exams. This time, Mia wasted no time cozying up to my mother, pleading with her to leave the house to her instead. She promised that once she earned money, she'd dedicate every cent to supporting my mother, sounding more considerate than I, her biological daughter, ever had. My stepfather, Andrew, stayed silent, frowning as he stared at his daughter. After a long pause, my mother smiled, pulling Mia close. Her shrewd eyes darted toward him. Casually, her hand brushed against a nearby photo of their family. A picture-perfect trio. When Andrew's gaze landed on the arrogant smile of his son in the photo, he finally broke his silence. "Mia, once the decision is made, there's no going back," he said. Mia's face lit up with triumph. She agreed eagerly, as if the house was already hers. Turning to me, she raised her eyebrows in mockery, her smile full of ridicule. Without sparing her a glance, I turned and walked out the door. Behind me, Mia skipped along, deliberately tripping me. "Now you have nothing, my dear sister," she taunted. I steadied myself against the wall, watching her retreating figure. My shoulders trembled as I hurried to my room, shutting the door behind me before finally letting out a laugh. "Oh, my foolish little sister. Did you really think I lost my life accidentally in my previous life?" Chapter 2. In my previous life, being named the heir changed little in my day-to-day existence. Mia's schemes became more inventive, while my brother's disdain deepened, laced with an inexplicable malice. I remained the family's unpaid servant, responsible for all the chores, and endured Mia's occasional bullying, often involving her friends targeting me at my part-time jobs. One day, my mother handed me a bright new coat. Her voice was unusually gentle as she asked me to buy some school supplies for James, saying he urgently needed them. I knew full well that James had no intention of continuing his studies. He was already planning his wedding. But, starved for maternal affection, I agreed without hesitation. On my way back, however, a large truck hit me, throwing me into the air. At the accident scene, my mother broke down, sobbing uncontrollably in front of the police. I wanted to reach out and comfort her, but then I saw my stepfather rushing over. From my ghostly perch, I overheard snippets of their conversation. Something about a massive insurance payout, £1,000,000, and the insurance beneficiary. My mother's grief disappeared in an instant. She exchanged a look with my stepfather, and together, they began a new round of theatrical wailing for the police. Watching them feign sorrow, I was stunned. So this was what my life was worth to them, £1,000,000. Enough to cover their son's bride price. In this life, Mia fought desperately to take my place as their pawn. I couldn't help but think of how, in my previous life, she blamed me for everything, eagerly shoving any trouble my way. Narrowing my eyes, I decided to gift her this honor of inheriting their twisted plans. At least she still had her father's occasional pity. I, on the other hand, was a child even my own mother didn't want. But even her father's rare tenderness paled in comparison to their precious son. For his sake, they took out another insurance policy, this time 2 of them. One for Mia. One for me. Standing outside their window, I overheard my mother's calculated persuasion. Think about it. Having one more policy won't hurt. When the payout comes, we can buy a bigger house for our son. Sure enough, even without my involvement, my mother wouldn't let me go. Exactly, Dad. And with a little extra money, I could even go to a private school, James added, his grating voice seeping through the window like poison. I clenched my fists tightly, suppressing the fury surging within me. Without hesitation, my stepfather agreed. To them, daughters were never anything more than commodities, measured and traded for their worth. Chapter 3. After securing Andrew's promise, Mia became even more brazen in showing her malice toward me. She not only flaunted her supposed victories in front of me, but also rallied her clique at school to intimidate me. When she saw me working hard and focusing on my studies, she couldn't care less. Someone like you? You'll never make it into college. Might as well start looking for a husband now, she sneered, as if her words carried any weight. I treated her taunts like background noise. Even at school, I made it a point to pretend she didn't exist. But Mia wasn't one to let things slide. After our monthly exams, she cornered me in the girls' bathroom with her posse. Grabbing a fistful of my hair, she jeered. What's the matter? Where's that haughty attitude of yours now? I smirked faintly, coughing to cover it up. Mia, Mom and Dad have already handed you the house. Rest assured, I won't compete with you for it. Her chin tilted up in triumph as she waved her minions aside. Feigning reluctance, I added, forget Mom and Dad. Even James can't compare to your cleverness. Mia scoffed. James? He's a nobody. If it weren't for the bit of my dad's blood in his veins, he'd have ended up worse than you. Lowering my gaze, I hid the mocking glint in my eyes. Basking in her friend's fawning admiration, Mia patted my face. Since you've been so well behaved, I'll spare you a soaking this time. With a flourish, she ordered her lackeys to shove me into a stall and jammed the door shut with a mop. As their footsteps faded, I let the facade drop. Quick hop and I was out of the stall. These antics, they couldn't hold me back even before high school. Taking out my phone, I reviewed the audio recording, made a few edits, and sent it to James using a new number. Our dear brother had a knack for cruelty and a low tolerance for provocation. I was genuinely curious about the performance waiting for me at home. Chapter 4. I deliberately went home late, knowing that Mia would be eagerly waiting to see me humiliated. Usually, if I arrived late and delayed dinner, my mother would waste no time accusing me of being unfilial, often accompanied by a slap or two. Today, however, as I walked back, I spotted James returning from an internet cafe, his face dark with anger. Feigning surprise, I raised a hand to wave at him, only to flinch and cover my face as he turned to look. James strode over, a sneer tugging at the corners of his mouth. Did Mia bully you again? I stammered incoherently, giving the impression of hesitation and fear. Apparently satisfied with my non-response, he muttered a string of curses and stormed off toward home. That little bitch. Does she really think she's someone important? Watching his retreating figure, I lowered my gaze, a fleeting icy smile crossing my lips. After all, my substantial insurance policy this time included my dear stepbrother. At a leisurely pace, I followed him from a distance, watching as he stomped up the stairs and slammed the door shut behind him. Leaning against the stairwell, I listened. Moments later, a ruckus erupted from inside. Mia, you bitch. I've been giving you face, and you think this is your house now? Watch how I teach you a lesson. A shrill voice quickly fired back. James, have you lost your mind? This is my home. You're the one who should get out. The sound of chaos and shouting grew louder. Bored, I glanced out the window. A familiar white car pulled up below, right on schedule. Satisfied, I started heading home. When I opened the door, I feigned shock at the scene before me and shouted, "Stop fighting!" James and Mia were tangled in a furious brawl, exchanging slaps, scratches, and insults. Stepping in to separate them, I made sure to land a few covert hits on each of them under the guise of pulling them apart. Noticing hurried footsteps approaching outside, I quickly stepped back, raising my voice. "Stop it! Mom and Dad would hate to see you acting like this." Just as I ducked, a water glass flew over my head and shattered against the wall. Behind me, a cry of pain made me spin around in alarm. There stood Andrew, clutching his forehead with one hand while my mother fussed over him anxiously. Another object, a filthy rag this time, was hurled across the room. I bent down as if to clean the mess on the floor, narrowly avoiding it. When I looked up, the rag had landed squarely on my mother's face. The room fell into stunned silence. Andrew's face darkened, his finger trembling as he pointed at all of us, too enraged to form coherent words. My mother, humiliated, peeled the rag off her face and stormed into the bathroom without a word. In the aftermath, I was left to clean up the mess, while James and Mia knelt on the floor, each nursing a red, stinging cheek from Andrew's punishment. As I swept up the shattered glass, I occasionally cast pitying glances their way, unable to hide my amusement. Andrew, noticing my expression, barked at me, "You're supposed to be the older sibling. Feeling sorry for them now is the same as encouraging their nonsense." I nodded obediently, but as soon as I turned away, my lips curled in mock sympathy. The punishment was far too mild for what they deserved. Chapter 5. After the monthly exams, I unexpectedly ranked in the top 200 of the grade, drawing astonished looks from my classmates. Mia, however, still hadn't learned her lesson. She eagerly spread rumors, claiming there was no way someone like me could achieve such a high score. Wherever she went, she made sure to mention it. Wendy must have cheated. Her words didn't bother me, and my indifference only fueled her hostility. She escalated her antics, leaving disgusting items on my desk at school: chewed gum, sticky wrappers, and once even a dead insect. Still, I ignored her. Between classes, I focused on my studies. After school, I threw myself into part-time jobs. Milk tea shop worker, restaurant server, supermarket cashier. Any place that paid, I was willing to try. Somehow, Mia caught wind of my jobs. She wasted no time reporting it to my homeroom teacher and embellishing the story with vile accusations. "She's earning dirty money," she whispered to anyone who would listen, casting doubt on my character. The rumors spread like wildfire. Soon, whenever I passed my classmates, I felt their eyes on me, pointing, whispering, judging. My homeroom teacher was the last person I wanted to hear about this. She was a sharp-tongued woman with a perpetually disapproving expression, always quick to pass judgment. True to form, she didn't give me a chance to explain. "Write a self-reflection," she demanded, her voice cold and clipped. As if that weren't enough, she also informed my mother, delighting in her role as the self-appointed enforcer of morality. When my mother arrived at school, the teacher didn't hold back. Her words were like a polished blade, cutting deep with feigned concern. "Mrs. White," she began, her gaze dripping with condescension, "it's fine for girls to care about their appearance, but they must maintain a pure heart. Making dirty money, well, that's just unacceptable." Chapter 6. She scanned me from head to toe, her eyes lingering as though appraising a defective product. "Wendy is a pretty girl," she continued, "but looks won't save her. A girl must stay clean in every sense of the word." My mother, eager to save face, nodded repeatedly, agreeing with every word. Then, without warning, she turned and slapped me so hard that my head snapped to the side. The sting of the slap wasn't what hurt the most. It was Mia's triumphant smirk, visible through the window, that pierced deeper. I pressed a hand to my stinging cheek and turned away, silent. The teacher, feigning shock, let out a dramatic gasp. "Oh, Mrs. White, there's no need to get physical. Just talk to her at home." She patted my shoulder with mock kindness, as if she were the hero in this farce, before urging my mother to discuss the matter calmly later. Back at home, I barely stepped through the door before my mother struck me again, this time even harder. "Where are you getting this filthy money? Do you know how humiliating this is for me? What will people say?" Her voice was shrill, her eyes wild with anger. But I didn't flinch this time. I simply met her gaze and answered calmly, "All the money I've earned has been for James." "For James?" she repeated, momentarily taken aback. "Yes," I said evenly. "Every cent I make is for his future, to help him support his wife someday." Her fury dissipated instantly, replaced by a satisfied smile. To her, being good to her son was the ultimate virtue. Anything that benefited him was worth overlooking. From that moment on, she stopped questioning my part-time jobs. It didn't matter how I earned the money. She knew it would eventually funnel into James's future. As for the slaps, they were like dust in the wind, quickly forgotten, as if they had never happened. Chapter 7. Mia, furious, told James about it. Before I could save much, James sent me a threatening text. "Wendy, hand over all your money. I'm running out of cash for the internet cafe. Hurry up or don't bother coming home." I glanced at the message and calmly replied that I'd give him the money in the evening. That night at home, I deliberately waited in the living room to hand a stack of cash to James just as Mia walked in. She rushed over furiously, but James shot her a warning glare before arrogantly taking the money and retreating to his room. Mia rounded on me, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Where did you get so much money? There's no way you earned this much from the milk tea shop." I smirked, amused by her confusion. "Who said it was all mine?" With a sly glance at James disappearing down the hallway, I leaned in and whispered to Mia, "It's because we have a better mother than you." Her face twisted with rage. "The house will be mine someday, and so will all the money in it." Crazy. I shrugged and walked back to my room. But as I turned, I caught exactly what I'd expected. Mia heading straight for James's room. James was notorious for saving half of whatever money he got. It was a habit everyone in the house knew about. Mom even praised him for being so frugal. Whether the money was actually saved, though, only James would know. That Friday after school, I figured James's latest stash must be running low. I asked my boss for time off and timed my return home perfectly. James was sitting in the living room, slouched with a gloomy expression. I strolled casually toward my room. "Hey, the money I saved is missing. Did you take it?" He jumped up, blocking my path with a scowl. Feigning confusion, I pulled out my salary from my bag. "What money?" "I just got paid today." I handed him the bills and he snatched them, counting quickly. "Why is it less? There was 10,000 last time." I cursed inwardly. That 10,000 had taken me ages to save. Outwardly, I smiled apologetically. "The boss has been short on cash lately. I'll make sure to bring the full amount next time." He sneered. So much effort for such a tiny amount. After a moment, his brows knit together as he eyed me suspiciously. "If you didn't take it, then who?" Chapter 8. I shifted my gaze to the side, and James followed it, landing on Mia's room. He cursed loudly. That little brat, picking up all her mom's sneaky habits. I blinked, suppressing a smirk. Like father, like daughter, they were all cut from the same cloth. I whipped up a quick meal and retreated to my room. Before locking the door tightly, I arranged my mom's beloved plants prominently where they'd be safe. When Mia came home, James charged at her like a bull, grabbing her hair and hurling insults. "You dare steal my money? I'll beat you to death." Mia shrieked and fought back, clawing at him. "Your mom favors you. Why can't I take back what's mine?" James, hot-headed and brainless, grew even more enraged. He lunged, grabbing the nearest object and hurling it at her. "All the money in this house is mine. Who cares how I get it?" I stood in my room, listening gleefully as the chaos unfolded. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed lights flickering downstairs. Our parents were on their way back. Feigning concern, I hurried out to break up the fight. "Come on, we're all from the same father. Why fight over my mom or your mom? Let it go." James snarled, throwing a punch at Mia. "You're nothing but a motherless runt. You're not my sister, go die." Mia let out an enraged scream, kicking him hard. "What's so great about having a mom? Your dad's still a loser. We're the same." Her words barely left her lips when a loud bang reverberated through the house. We all froze as my stepfather appeared at the doorway, his face dark as a thundercloud. James, ever the opportunist, broke the silence first. "Dad, she stole my money. Kick her out." Mia wasn't one to back down. "Your money? Dad promised me the house. That means everything in it is mine." James, trembling with fury, almost blurted out something crucial. "The house isn't even." "Enough." Andrew's thunderous roar silenced them both. He shot James a glare sharp enough to cut steel, and James immediately clamped his mouth shut. Then, trembling with rage, Andrew pointed at both Mia and me. "Get out. Both of you." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. Mia lagged behind, shooting daggers at James before reluctantly following me. As we stood in the hallway, my mom returned, sparing us barely a glance before slamming the door shut behind her. Mia sneered, her voice dripping with mockery. "Look at you. Even with a mom, you're worse off than me. I rolled my eyes and muttered under my breath, crazy. After cooling down a bit, Mia suddenly shoved me hard, her face twisted with anger. You told on me, didn't you? You conniving little rat. She raised her hand to push me again, but I sidestepped and whispered, I didn't have a choice. James said if I didn't tell him, I'd be kicked out of the house. Her eyes filled with disdain as she snorted, Coward. Then she tilted her chin arrogantly. The house is going to be mine. He doesn't get to say otherwise. I nodded absent-mindedly, keeping my thoughts to myself. Silly sister. If it were really yours, you wouldn't be out here with me. You'd be inside basking in their affection. Chapter 9. Andrew only remembered us after midnight. We stood outside, shivering from the cold. When we were finally allowed in, James let out a disdainful snort, the kind that seemed to come straight from his nose with deliberate contempt. Andrew's gaze was even colder, practically freezing. I glanced at my mother, who acted as if nothing was happening. Her indifference reminded me that the inevitable day might come sooner than I had anticipated. I buried myself in studying and working harder than ever, handing over less money each time. But James didn't care. To him, it was just a matter of time before everything in the house would be his. Mia was equally dismissive of my tireless efforts, mocking my early mornings and late nights. She thought she had me figured out, believing I could barely scrape together enough grades to enter college just like before. But the haunting memory of my past life's pain kept me going. The sharp agony of being crushed beneath a truck often replayed in my nightmares, and my mother's false syrupy affection had become my most vivid torment. I would jolt awake in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, the ghost of that excruciating pain still clinging to me. To quiet my mind, I'd pull out some practice exams and bury myself in solving problems until exhaustion overtook me. The days flew by, thanks to the constant squabbles between Mia and James, and soon the college entrance exams were upon us. Despite my homeroom teacher's relentless efforts to humiliate me during class, my grades steadily climbed, breaking into the top 100 rankings in the entire grade. On the day of the exams, Mia finally lost her composure. With her current grades, she might have been able to squeeze into a vocational school. But in this life, she'd wasted too much time fixating on the so-called family inheritance, letting her studies slip while focusing solely on currying favor with James. Meanwhile, all I had to do was perform as usual, and getting into a top-tier university wouldn't be a problem. When the results came out, Mia's foul mood was palpable. She hadn't just done poorly. She couldn't even qualify for a vocational school. Desperate, she turned to Andrew, tears streaming down her face. Dad, you've already arranged a school for James. Please help me too. I'm your daughter as well. She sobbed, hoping her pitiful act would soften his heart. But Andrew had already made up his mind. In his eyes, neither of us deserved an education. Seeing his silence, Mia clenched her jaw and tried another angle. Dad, didn't you promise to give me the house? I'll split it with James if you just help me find a school. She brought up the house again, and I saw my mother's expression sour further. My mother would rather eat glass than let someone else claim the house. Agreeing to change the heir's name had already been her absolute limit. No matter how Mia cried and begged, Andrew remained unmoved. Finally, Mia snapped. Slamming her hands on the table, she shouted, If you don't help me, I'll report you to the Education Bureau. Let's see how you keep your job. Her words made Andrew's eyes darken. He stared at her, a cold, venomous glare that made her shrink back slightly, though she still kept her head high in defiance. Some people never learn when to stop. Every move she made seemed to land squarely on someone's most sensitive nerve. I caught the flicker of murderous intent in Andrew's gaze, a fleeting but unmistakable sign of his growing fury. When his eyes shifted to me, I lowered my head, feigning obedience, careful not to draw any attention to myself. Chapter 10. My mother finally lost her patience, waving me back to my room and sending Mia off to hers. I quietly climbed out the window and hid beneath their bedroom to eavesdrop. Thankfully, it was only the first floor, so it wasn't too dangerous. Sure enough, I overheard my mother and stepfather talking. I feel like Mia isn't listening to us, my mother said. At some point, James had slipped into their room. His raspy voice cut through the air. Dad, why don't we move the plan forward? I can't deal with that crazy woman anymore. Andrew stayed silent as if weighing his options. Growing impatient, my mother pressed him. "You can't catch a wolf without sacrificing a lamb." "I was willing to use my own daughter. What are you hesitating for?" Andrew patted her shoulder, trying to soothe her. "It's not that I'm hesitating. I'm just figuring out the best approach." Then he called out to James. "Come on, James, let's head downstairs." A chill ran down my spine. I rushed back to my room, locking the door and making sure it looked like someone was inside. Once everything seemed secure, I climbed out the window again and snuck down to the bushes nearby. Fortunately, the rusty railings my mother had neglected to fix made sneaking out relatively easy. Hidden in the bushes, I raised my phone just as Andrew and James approached the car. It was the middle of the night, the streets completely deserted. Dressed in absurd black outfits and wearing gloves, they smashed the car window a few times and then destroyed the dashcam. Laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened, they walked back inside. I replayed the recording on my phone, frowning in confusion. If they were planning to stage a car accident, why would they only target the dashcam? I carefully saved the recording, backed it up, and stored it on a USB drive, which I kept with me at all times. The next day, Andrew called the property management office. In our old neighborhood, the surveillance cameras hadn't worked in ages. When the staff learned it was just a broken dashcam and a few worthless items missing, they didn't even bother reporting it to the police. Instead, they handed over some compensation money and casually filed a note about the incident. Watching their ridiculous thief-catching act, I decided to make my move. As I went downstairs, I accidentally knocked my mother's phone out of her hand. By the time she noticed, the malware had already wormed its way into her system. It was a nifty little tool I had spent a lot of money and effort to acquire. After all, a simple recording wouldn't be enough to serve as evidence. Chapter 11. After that incident, the atmosphere at home became strangely harmonious. James rarely provoked Mia, and sometimes even showed humility. Mia, feeling triumphant, stopped worrying about her education. Andrew and Mother, facing Mia's arrogance, no longer restrained her. Sometimes they even encouraged her behavior. This made Mia even more reckless. One day, after I finished washing the dishes and cleaning the house, Mia dumped a basket of dirty laundry on the floor. Arrogantly, she ordered me to clean her clothes while my mother and James watched without intervening. I frowned at the pile of smelly clothes, about to speak when Andrew came out of his room with an announcement. "You're all growing up, some going to college, some entering society. I'm getting old and we won't have many chances to gather like this. Let's go for a picnic tomorrow." After a heartfelt speech, he even wiped his eyes. My mother and James echoed his sentiments. Mia, ever the dutiful daughter, wiped his eyes. "Dad, don't be sad. I'll always take care of you." "Wendy, you should come too," Andrew said kindly. I nodded without a word. The scene was heartwarming, but I saw the eagerness and greed in Andrew's eyes. The next day, Andrew made sure we were all in the car, even checking if everyone was present. We chatted and laughed on the way, except for James, who occasionally smirked maliciously, unable to hide his true nature. I observed everyone in the car, each with their own thoughts, but outwardly harmonious. I smirked, gripping my phone tightly, feeling a sense of anticipation. When we arrived, Andrew parked the car in a spot without surveillance. Though there were no cameras, the area was busy with tourists. To Andrew, it was the perfect crime scene. We spent the day happily together. As we packed up to leave, I noticed Andrew signaling James. James claimed he needed to use the restroom and told us to wait in the car. Andrew nodded, leading us back to the car. After half an hour, my mother grew impatient. "Why isn't James back? I'll go check on him." Andrew told her to be careful, but she turned back. "Jack, I'm scared to go alone. Come with me." Andrew frowned, glancing at us. Mia, playing the dutiful daughter, smiled. "Dad, you and Auntie go ahead. I'll be fine here." Seeing this, Andrew handed us 2 bottles of water. "Drink if you're thirsty. Stay in the car, it's safer." Mia, unsuspecting, took a big gulp and waved them off. I took a sip and waved too. Andrew turned and left, pressing the car key. As he did, I pressed my lock jammer. Hearing the click, Andrew left, reassured. I watched him and my mother walk away, feeling a sense of mockery. What a flimsy excuse, what terrible acting. Chapter 12. I waited until they were out of sight, then tried to open the car door, but Mia stopped me. She disapproved. "Didn't you hear Dad? Stay in the car." I looked at her. "He's your dad, not mine. Are you getting out or not?" She rolled her eyes. "Why would I get out when I'm fine here?" I was about to argue, but she waved me off. "Take your stuff and leave. Don't bother me." I snorted, closing the door and running to an open area. Even a small sip of that water made me feel weak. I checked my phone, seeing the call logs and recordings from my mother's phone. I made a call. Just then, a large truck, seemingly out of control, swerved past other cars and headed straight for Andrew's car. I watched as the small car flipped several times before crashing to the ground. No wonder Andrew had put red stickers on the car, saying it was to make it easier to find. Through the clear window, I saw a flashback of the truck that had hit me in my previous life. The man in the truck had laughed maliciously, aiming straight for me. Bang! A loud crash echoed and people rushed to the scene. They pulled the drunk truck driver out, angrily scolding him. Soon, an ambulance arrived and several strong men carefully lifted the car, rescuing Mia. "She's alive!" a girl cried out. I stood in the crowd watching from a distance. Memories of my previous death flooded back. Unlike Mia, I was covered with a cold white sheet. No one dared to approach my body. Only my mother had pretended to mourn over me. Chapter 13. I hid in the crowd watching as Andrew, mother, and James rushed over. Before they even reached the scene, Andrew started wailing, with my mother and James following suit. I coldly observed the scene, almost identical to my previous life. My two daughters in the prime of their lives, how could this happen? Andrew grabbed the truck driver, shaking him violently, wishing he could send him to hell. The crowd murmured, and Andrew looked at them for help. Hearing police sirens, Andrew's eyes lit up and he rushed over. "Officer, please save my daughter. I only have two daughters," he cried, clutching the stern-faced officer. "How can I live without them?" Finally, someone spoke up. "But there was only one girl in the car." "Impossible," Andrew retorted, glaring at the person. "What do you know?" "I know who's in the car. That's my daughter." The officer brushed off his hand. According to medical personnel, there was only one young girl in the car. "How can you be sure there were two?" Andrew hesitated, and my mother and James looked confused. I saw two before I left," he stammered. "The car is wrecked. How could they survive?" Andrew wiped his tears, clutching his chest. A girl shouted, "You didn't even look and said both daughters were dead." Hearing this, Andrew glared. "What do you know? Go home, girl." But the crowd murmured in agreement, knowing the girl in the ambulance was alive. Something was clearly wrong. The officer showed his badge. According to reports, Zhang Bauman and his family are suspected of buying high-value insurance and planning murder. "You're under arrest." More officers arrived, approaching Andrew and his family. "Impossible," my mother screamed. "What are you talking about? Do you have evidence?" The lead officer glanced back and I stepped forward, smiling at my shocked mother. "I am the evidence." Andrew pointed at me. "You drank." "I locked the car." "How did you escape?" I waved the lock jammer. "You mean this?" My mother, enraged, tried to rush at me but was stopped by the police. "You set up your own mother and framed your stepfather. You'll die a horrible death." I laughed, playing the recording. "Hey Mike, remember to hit them hard tomorrow. I'll give you 50,000. My mother froze, sweat forming on her brow. The crowd fell silent in disbelief. I pressed another button. "Mike, we're ready. Jack drugged them. They won't escape." Andrew's face turned gray, collapsing to the ground. The truck driver, Mike, tried to flee but was tackled by the crowd. Their precious son, realizing they were caught, trembled and shouted, "Don't come near me. It's their fault. Arrest my parents." James, pathetic and terrified, was a disgrace. "Amy, you raised a fine son." The crowd whispered, their words crushing them. I handed all the evidence to the police, following them to file the case. Before leaving, Andrew glared at me, as if trying to tear me apart with his eyes. I smiled back. "No matter how much you want to destroy me, I no longer fear you. It's time to end this." Epilogue. The case quickly caused an uproar online, shocking netizens. People couldn't believe such cruel parents existed. To get dowry money for their son, they plotted to kill their daughters. A well-known lawyer offered to help me with the case for free. After discussing and understanding her intentions, I agreed to let Lindsay represent me. Later, Anshire Intermediate People's Court sentenced Mike, Jack, Amy, and James to death for intentional homicide, with lifelong deprivation of political rights. As for Mia, her luck was slightly better than mine in my previous life. She survived thanks to her seatbelt but would spend the rest of her life as a vegetable. The 60-square-meter house they left behind was sold. I donated part of the money to a nursing home and used the rest for Mia's medical expenses. I owed her nothing. I successfully got into a good university. Though I had no family left, I wasn't afraid of being alone. The money I earned in high school was enough to cover my tuition for a while. I applied for financial aid, and though life might be tough, my freedom had just begun. I had no regrets.